So Kevin, thanks for being back on the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, it's great to be here, Richard. It's fun.
Great. Well, how is retirement life for you?
Well, it's a little bit less hectic. I don't have a teaching schedule, and so but working hard and still hoping for a breakthrough in our common movement.
Yeah. Well, you're working hard on researching human origins and the origins of the white race, and you're actually going to be talking about this subject at the upcoming MPI conference, Become Who We Are. So I was thinking we could just have a conversation about where you are in this greater research project, and we could flesh out some of the key concepts here. So why don't we start with just something very simple, and that is, what is race itself? And because that term, it's very tricky. It's obviously an extremely loaded term now in our contemporary. It's a political weapon more than a descriptive scientific term. But it's also, I mean, throughout history, the concept of race has meant many different things, related things, however. So why don't you talk a little bit about that when you're talking about the origins of a people? What do you mean by this? How explain race?
Well, yeah, I agree. Race is a very difficult concept, and but basically, from a biological point of view, we have the idea that there are biological descent groups that have common ancestors. They're sort of related like a family. Mm-hmm. And when you do population genetic research, you notice that there are sort of breaks. You know that if you look at, they say, the African groups, Asian, European, that there's a sort of break. It's not a smooth climb, as we say. There's a sort of break there, and so we are different. We have a different history, a different evolutionary history. But we have common ancestors, and fairly recently compared to others. And so we are more closely related to each other. You and I are more closely related to each other than either of us would be to an African or an Asian.
Right.
There are, and historically, this has not been a problem. But of course, recently these attacks have really been from the left to sort of get rid of the entire concept of race. And we have to acknowledge, though, that there is a cognitive, political, ideological content to race, that people can manipulate these things, that people can try to, alter the perceptions of race. And I think that has been a very, very important thing. It's really been part of the program to sort of put forth the idea that whites don't have any ethnic interests. There's no such thing as a biological race. We're all the same. We're all human, and we're far more related to each other than an African or something like that, which is completely false. But the point is that there is a strong ideological component to this now that is essentially an effort to make us think that there is no such thing as race. Therefore, we don't have any ethnic interests. We're not a group that can be scientifically categorized in any way. But I think that's been pretty well shot down now by people like Nicholas Wade recently, and quite a few biologists. I mean, this is just a very common belief in biology now. You wouldn't understand that reading the media like the New York Times, but and a lot of other media. But that's what I would say is the general state of things. You can easily find biologists, even Richard Dawkins will talk. There is such a thing as race. So it's.
Yeah.
I believe
he likes to talk about how the dangers of Christianity and the joys of atheism more than he talks about race. I've seen, but there's certainly in the past, Dawkins has unquestionably been a race realist.
Right.
It's kind of interesting. Why don't we do this before we get into the origins of the white man? Why don't we just talk a little bit about these ideological aspects that you brought up, and maybe one way of thinking about it would be that there seems to be these almost kind of waves of intellectual activity, kind of paradigms, so to speak, and after the Darwinian revolution, and then certainly in the dawn of genetics, you had this explosion of race thinking, and the eugenics movement, which was hand in glove with that kind of movement. So you had this tremendous amount of energy and interesting discoveries on this side, and you can think about that as Madison Grant or more like political thinkers like Lothrop Stoddard, but just a whole host of people in that for like a half a century. And then we almost had like a half a century of race denial, maybe coming after Ashley Montagu and people like Stephen Jay Gould, who was an evolutionist, but would deny race and was a kind of weird evolutionist. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? And that's all coming after the Second World War. And then maybe we might be kind of breaking through now where people, despite the fact that race itself is so politically charged in our society, they kind of almost can't help themselves but be interested in it because there's so much information. They're going to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, or they're thinking about how their ethnicity makes them prone or not prone to certain heritable diseases. And, it's almost like we have maybe the signs of a rebirth of race thinking. So maybe why don't we just get into that before we talk about the history of race? Well, let's just get into that ideological aspect and this kind of explosion of race thinking, and then this reaction to it of trying to suppress racial thinking.
Yes, I think that this revolution where the Darwinian paradigm was overthrown is probably the most important aspect of sort of what you might call a downfall of Western societies. I mean, there was a period of ethnic defense. Early in the 20th century, you mentioned Madison Grant, Lothrop Stoddard. There were quite a few other people. It was not just people on the fringes. These were very much establishment figures. They had access to the media. They would be writing in Collier's and Life magazine or whatever. Yeah. And Reader's Digest is very common. Charles Lindbergh was writing in that way. And that was overthrown. And it's interesting. I've done some research on that. And even by the 1930s, it was getting very hard to talk about race, or certainly not about Nordics. You had Franz Boas beginning around 1910, 1915, dominating the American Anthropological Association by 1925. And people like Madison Grant were just relegated to the fringes. In fact, by World War II, Lothrop Stoddard was seen as a security risk. And he couldn't lecture at West Point anymore at the military college. He was cut off from the media. So this happened really, I'd say in the 1930s, but it ballooned after World War II. After World War II, you had the complete, eclipse of that point of view. And you had the rise of various intellectual movements, the Frankfurt School, the people like Sidney Hook, the people around Partisan Review. You had just the sort of rise of the left, and certainly the academic world was a huge focus of the left after World War II, and that is essentially where the origins of this are now. This was always a political move. You mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, just blatantly political. We know now that some of his research was mistaken, if not fraudulent, probably fraudulent. And the same, by the way, with Franz Boas. He tried to show that when people immigrated to America from Europe, that their skull shape actually changed because of environmental influences. Well, they redid that data. It didn't show that at all. But for 100 years, this was held up as a standard of research in biological anthropology, showing that the environment is everything, race doesn't mean anything, that sort of thing. But it's been a political thrust. There's no question that people like Boas and Gould were motivated by their ethnic identities. A lot of evidence for that. And that is sort of my perspective. Obviously, my book, The Culture Critique, makes that argument. That these and in historical perspective, I think the decline of Madison Grant and those people, that was really the first big blow to our to America as a white European country. By the time the immigration debates came around in 1965, nobody could talk about the ethnic interests of Europeans. It was all about the morality of letting in everybody. It was immoral to make distinction between races. Everybody's equal. That rhetoric was flying around the Senate in 1965. It was part of the sort of, and it was so entrenched by then that when Edward Kennedy held hearings for people opposed to the bill, he just had them in his office. It just wasn't even, it was such a done deal by then. It was just, it was not even intellectually possible to defend having a bias in our immigration policy that favored Northwestern Europe. That was the end of it. And then since then, of course, we've just seen the huge increase in numbers and ever greater control by the academic world and the media by the left.
Do you think Jewish influence was a decisive factor? Just in the sense of what you were mentioning, it wasn't just one movement. There seemed to be a whole host of different things. There's Frankfurt Schools, kind of post-Marxism. Stephen Jay Gould was a kind of sunny side up public intellectual who would talk about baseball and jazz music and all this kind of Americana and things like that. But he also identified to some degree with socialism. Or do you think there were other factors? Because obviously, it wasn't just a matter of antagonism by Jews. There was the other factor was that the white population seemed to abdicate its authority.
Yes, it certainly did, and the most important book on this, I think, is Eric Kaufman's book on the rise and fall of Anglo-America. Now, in that book, he attributes the fall of Anglo-America to a sort of combination of Jews and WASPs sort of agreeing that cosmopolitanism was the way to go. And I have an extended argument with him about that. I think that it was far more the Jews who were strongly identified as Jews. Again, if you look at the people around Partisan Review, if you look at Stephen Jay Gould, if you look at the Frankfurt School, Boas, all these people very strongly identified as Jews and very clear that they didn't want the idea that there was any possibility or any even discussion of racial superiority by Europeans. But that wasn't even, it went far beyond racial superiority, any kind of racial identity or even the existence of race as a concept. And emphasizing cosmopolitanism and immigration from all peoples as a sort of moral imperative that went beyond the interests of the United States. The interests of the United States were not important. This is explicitly stated not only by Jewish organizations but by Jewish intellectuals like Sidney Hook, the Partisan Review crowd, all on page with that. And this is in the 1940s. So it's been a full court press. And my view is that there certainly were WASPs that went along with this. One good example is John Dewey, the educator, who was very much on the left, but he's also very promoted by Jewish interests. In other words, these people made alliances with willing non-Jews, as they always have, and they still do. We see that all the time. If you look at the power of these movements, the central characters, who are the gatekeepers here? And in this case, the gatekeepers were people, like Philip Robb, who was the editor of Partisan Review. If you look at the Frankfurt School, they have very strong, criteria for being a member of that. And certainly Habermas was not Jewish. He was allowed in, but he was allowed in based on condition that he towed their line, and that's what we see over and over again. That these non-Jewish intellectuals who cooperated basically lived in a Jewish world. You can see that with neocons now. I mean, there are any number of non-Jews who go along with neocon foreign policy positions, and they can get on Fox News and have jobs in think tanks. But they are there sort of as almost window dressing to where the real power is.
Right. Well, let's get into this question of human origins and racial origins. So why don't I don't where's the best place to start for thinking about this? When I guess maybe a good place to start would be when do you think that we could say that there was a Aryan or Indo-European race? Like when could you say that? I know there's never any borders in these concepts because everything is a continuum. It's not a group. But nevertheless, when do you think you could definitively say that there was an Aryan race?
Well, that's I haven't really approached it from that direction, but you'd have to say that well prior to the ice ages, 40, 50,000, 45,000 years ago, that in Europe there were Stone Age hunters, gatherers. Those people had white skin and so on. They retreated during the ice ages and so on. Where I've sort of taken my beginning is recent population genetic evidence. That really there are three different invasions, you might say, or settlements of Europe, all by people who are not too distantly related. But the first one were these hunter-gatherers, and at least by 8,000 years ago, and before that, because they were the ones that were there even prior to that, but they receded with the ice ages, went back. But then about 7,000 years ago, you had an invasion sort of from the Middle East, so the so-called Middle Eastern farmers, and they were certainly an important group. And you can still see within Europe, you can see this population, these population genetic differences, with the North being more hunter-gatherer, the South being more Middle Eastern. Coming from that gene pool. But the other great group that I think you mentioned, the Indo-Europeans, and this is a very important group. All of our European languages and quite a few other languages are basically Indo-European languages. They come from that group. And beginning around 4,500 years ago, these people spread out from the so-called Pontic steppes, which is part of contemporary Ukraine, and they just conquered wherever they went. They had a number of advantages. They had wagons. They had tamed horses. They were able to use the so-called secondary products, milk and cheese and everything. And they developed an incredible military culture, which was just a completely militarized culture, where young men were, had to go on raids as part of the so-called rites of passage. And it was extremely successful. They conquered everywhere they went. Now, when they went down to India or even over in Western Asia, East Asia, that they were sort of absorbed by the local peoples, and they became really a not really European group anymore. But in Europe, they settled other areas and dominated other peoples. They dominated these hunter-gatherers. They dominated these Middle Eastern farmers. And you had these military cultures. What was interesting about them is that, first of all, they are white, they are European, and they are also, very importantly, individualistic. And that's what the point that I want to make is that what's so unique about Europe is individualism. We are really the only culture area that prizes individualism. You go to the Middle East, you go to China, you go to Africa, you tend to have clan-based societies based on kinship relations. The thing about the Indo-Europeans is they certainly had some idea of relatedness, but more important than that was to be a member of one of these warrior groups, so-called Mannerbund in German. Yeah. These were successful, but they were sort of meritocratic. That is, if you were, you say you were not part of the Indo-European group, you could become part of those military groups if you were a good warrior. You could be if you managed to become the chief of one of these groups, you could easily be deposed if you didn't do very well. It was always at the sort of sufferance of the others. You didn't have despotic rule ever. They were all peer groups. So it's much more based on, it's not like I call it a free market sort of thing, where if you were good, you rose, even if you were not part of that group. They didn't have strong barriers between the groups when they settled, So kinship was important, it was there, but it was subordinated to these other groups that were more important for military success. And those, so it really is it's a form of individualism. And this form of individualism, and this is based a lot of it on the work of Ricardo Duchesne, very important professor up in Canada, emphasizing these Indo-European military groups. Basically, that type of social structure existing in Europe with their Germanic tribes and Scandinavia and so on into the Middle Ages in Europe. But since then, declining for various reasons. And so the other point that I make is that we have to pay attention to these northern hunter-gatherers as almost a successor culture to the Indo-European military cultures that we saw before. Much more egalitarian, much more focused on being part of groups, but again, kinship being de-emphasized. The common denominator here is that kinship's not that important. What is important is your reputation. For the Indo-Europeans, it's your reputation as a warrior. For the hunter-gatherers, it's more of a reputation as morally on board, having a good reputation, extremely egalitarian. And so a lot of my historical work has been to chart the rise of these really egalitarian groups, especially in Northern Europe, which sort of follows the population genetic evidence. Looking at groups like the Quakers, the Puritans, that have been successors, that have not really had the attributes of these typical Indo-European cultures. They have not been, militaristic. They have not been hierarchical. They're much more egalitarian. And what I'm trying to make is a long-term argument, in a nutshell, is that this egalitarianism in the modern context has been really a pathology in the West, that we are suffering from over-egalitarianism, and that we are too prone to sort of to seeing to seeing moral principles as the basis of group formation, ignoring these natural fault lines related to race and biology and even kinship. So I talk about. I've actually written an academic paper on the sort of long-term movement to end slavery in the UK, in Britain, beginning in the late 18th century. And it's an amazing story. These people, they're just the opposite of Indo-European type groups, extremely egalitarian, very empathic, concerned about the sufferings of Africans. Willing to give up, make huge sacrifices on their behalf, and really, really engaging in strong critiques of their own people. Really, you think of one of the big conflicts, of course, is the Civil War, which pitted the much more egalitarian North. Puritan-based culture, very idealistic. It's another big trait of these northern hunter-gatherers is idealism, hating slavery. All the anti-slavery movements came from New England, really, which came ultimately from Puritan culture, against the cavalier sort of military culture of the South.
Yeah, that
was the last big battle, and in other words, this egalitarianism has won out, and in a way you could say that's wonderful, but it's become completely warped now and taken advantage of by people who hate us. They're pushing these egalitarian moral points of view on us. So we have to admit every immigrant who wants to come here and that kind of thing. Everybody who's got a sob story or who's not have a very good life over in Africa, well, bring them to America. Or refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. And so we're being inundated with this sort of empathic altruism that it's our undoing.
Do you think, and I'm speculating here, but do you think there was an element of group evolution where there were certain you could say, tensions within our race. And I'm just thinking about the tripartite structure of Indo-European culture, of those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. You could also think about it as a warrior, an aristocracy ultimately derived from being warriors, a kind of another class of people who are more interested in making money or selling and buying and selling or working, and then a kind of spiritual class as well. And it seems like what's happened in the modern world is that we've seen the destruction of these aristocracies, or just the decadence of these aristocracies. You might have some. Sweden has a king or something, or a royal family. These people might as well be, Sunday school instructors. They're not aristocrats by any stretch. But that we've lost that Aryan or warrior component, that type of person who wants to guard the gates, who is willing to confront the other. Who thinks who has a kind of a meritocratic as opposed to egalitarian worldview, and that we basically have societies that are focused on a kind of spiritualism that you could say is this egalitarian morality that we all embrace, but also it also gives a tremendous amount of power, far too much in my opinion, to basically the bourgeois element, people who think in terms of buying and selling. And so conservatives are really excited about taxes and small business regulation, and maybe they're right about all that stuff, but who cares? We don't have that kind of or we've taken the power away from those types of people who naturally want to rule, that Aryan spirit.
I agree with that, and Andrew Fraser's book is very interesting in that regard, talking about the Puritans, way too commercial, and there's this element of sort of economic individualism that we've always had to control, our business elites, because they want to just import cheap labor. They don't care about anything else. That they want to make money. And so, that had to be controlled, and it was controlled. I mean, with the 1924 immigration law, put restrictions essentially on businesses. The businesses were not the big opponents of that 1924 immigration law, but because we didn't have a globalized economy anywhere near the extent. But yeah, I mean, that group has got to be controlled, and we see it over and over again. We see there's this guy Peter Sutherland in the UK. He's a former Goldman Sachs executive, just stumping for more and more refugees. He's an Irishman, and he just wants he wants Europe to be inundated as quickly as possible, and it's just mercantile kinds of attitudes. It's very that is something that we have to control. Frankly, if you or I got in power, I think we would put controls on our bourgeois capitalist class. We would certainly not destroy capitalism, but they would have to conform to our ethnic interests and not simply import the world in order to lower wages and stuff like that. So I think that's a big problem, and it has happened certainly in the 19th century. If you look at Eric Kaufman's book I mentioned on the rise and fall of Anglo-America, you saw capitalists willing to import Asians. They had to be controlled, and they were controlled. You had the Asian Exclusion Act, and so there was a uprising against that. But again, once that period of ethnic defense collapsed in the 1930s. And then the whole thing mushroomed after World War II. All that was lost, and so you can't go on the Senate floor and say we have to preserve white America. We have to have an immigration policy that answers the ethnic interests of the majority. You can't even say that anymore. It's a disaster.
Yeah, and it's just to tie a bow on that. I think in a way, one of the reasons why the Europeans dominated the world was that we did have that tension within our societies. We had different things going on, different types of people pursuing different things, but they could kind of work. It could balance itself out. Like any society that's going to be productive needs bourgeois people buying and selling and stuff like that. I mean, one reason Africa is a disaster is they don't have enough small businessmen and big businessmen. But nevertheless, it seems like when we take out one component that was essential to our dominance of the world, the whole thing falls apart. It's like if you take off a wheel of a car, it's not like it's a quarter as good as it used to be. It doesn't even run. A car with 3 wheels is not going to even go anywhere. It seems to be that's almost where we are. It's like we've lost our aristocracy and our Aryan spirit, and so we're kind of left with these two things that are almost bad without the Aryan spirit, and that is our bourgeois tendencies and our kind of spiritual, you could say, Christian egalitarian tendencies, right, as well. But
there's a couple of great quotes from Ricardo Duchesne. He says, "It is my contention that the aristocratic culture of Indo-Europeans was dominated," and he italicized that, "by men whose souls were too high-spirited, too intrepid, too indifferent about fortune." And he says, "The expansionist aggression of the West is an inescapable expression of its roots in these Indo-European Aryan men who are free and therefore headstrong and ambitious, sure of themselves, easily offended, unwilling to accept quiet subservience. The highly strung and obstinate aristocrat has been a fundamental source of destruction in Western history, as well as a source of all that is good and inspiring."
Duchenne is a kind of Nietzschean. Duchenne has his Nietzschean moments when he talks like that. It's a very, very good.
Yeah, but it's like what you're saying. You take away this aristocratic sensibility. You're taking away something that has been essential to the expansion of the West. I don't think that the Puritans and these egalitarians would have ever done what they did, and that spirit is something that we have to hope can be retrieved somehow. Mm-hmm. That we have to find men like that.
Yeah. Well, let's change the subject just a little bit. I was curious about the development of, I guess you could call them ethnicities, but it's probably better to call them sub-races. Because you talked before about some Middle Eastern farmers, some hunter-gatherers, and then the Aryans as these 3 groups that formed the white race. But what do you think about the development of some of these sub-peoples within the white race? And definitely this is also a continuum. But I'm thinking about Slavs versus what you could say Germans, that is central and to a large degree of Western Europe. And also Latins, the Spanish, the Italians, and so on. What are some of your thoughts about the development of these, sub-races within the white race?
Well, there certainly are these sub-races and subgroups, and they have been quite often a source of conflict, frankly. Germans mm-hmm. and Poles, Serbs and Croats. That is part of the story of Western history. Is we've had these huge conflicts. So you've had Denmark, the Danes against the Swedes, and then the Danes invading England and the Anglo-Saxons. There are these different groups, and I think that historically they're important, and I hope they survive. But I think all white people have to have the understanding that we are closely related. We can't have any more world wars like World War I and World War II. Mm-hmm. Those are just absolutely disastrous to us. And we have to sort of live and let live and not care too much about territory. It really doesn't matter if you have 100, especially nowadays, it doesn't matter if you have some of these old borders that my understanding is that, especially in Eastern Europe, these nationalists are still concerned about where the border is between Romania and Hungary or something like that.
It's terrible. I mean, these Ukrainian people slaughtering ethnic Russians in eastern their country. It's just terrible.
What's that about? And so we have to understand that these things have to just be a part of history and get over that. And that's why that this was sort of the dream of the EU. You would get rid of nationalism. Instead it's become the EU has become a disaster, really a huge incident for the suicide of Europe. But there was a rationale for trying to get beyond petty nationalisms that has been so poisonous in the past, and we have to intellectually have to understand why that is important for us to do.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the future. And you were saying, so you would say that the white race as a coherent entity is on the order of, say, 50,000 years old. Is that
Yeah, probably at least that. They say now, that they just found a skeleton in China, so finding an anatomically modern human in China 80,000 years ago. I think that shocked everybody, because I think these dates are going to have to be revised, because the previous line was that modern humans evolved in Africa about 50,000 years ago, and then they spread out elsewhere and differentiated and so on. I don't think that story, is locked up at this point. I really don't know. But, yeah, probably Europeans existed, people colonized, settled in Europe 45,000 years ago, I'd say. And, of course, they were hunter-gatherers at that time. Stone Age, hunter-gatherers. You didn't have metals or anything. And then you had the ice ages. So we've been there a very long time, and it just recently, a couple days ago, some minister gets up in Sweden and says Sweden has always been this nation of immigrants and so on. Well, yeah, 45,000 years ago, people immigrated to Sweden, I suppose you could say. But come on, it's absolutely absurd. It's just a tool to destroy the Swedish culture and the Swedish people.
Right.
It's absurd, but this is what we're dealing with now.
Right. I mean, people will have these non sequiturs like that. I mean, they'll the Angles and the Saxons at some point were in conflict and then came together. Therefore, mass immigration. Right. It's just a total. Nothing follows from the other thing. But let me before I was going to ask I am kind of curious about the future and the prospect for extinction, as dreadful as that sounds. But let me just go back to one thing you mentioned. This out of Africa theory has been dominant, at least in my adult lifetime. I've always heard about it, and sometimes it's kind of that theory has almost become a political correctness tool where we're all from Africa and we're all Africans. I've heard that again. None of this is just total non sequitur. But do you think that is being questioned? That or at least questioned in terms of the time frame of the out of Africa? And I was just thinking. Carlton Kuhn had he's someone that I would imagine a lot of contemporary scientists are not referencing, but he actually theorized parallel development of the races. He thought that these races were much older. Do you think maybe we're almost moving towards a Kuhn's time frame?
I wouldn't rule that out at all. We published an article by a physical anthropologist in Oxford Quarterly, and his point was that if you look at the data, that the evidence of human culture in Africa, predating what you find, say, in Europe, is very thin, and there is an element of political correctness to it. They want the idea that humans, evolved in Africa fairly recently, and we're all from the same stock, kind of thing, and so it's just a very different kind of. I don't think that has been locked up. I wouldn't want to say it's wrong, but I'd be skeptical about it because there is such a big element of political correctness to it, and he points that out. If you look at who's really pushing those theories, a lot of them are on the political left, and they're hostile to us basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me let's end on a darker note. I think we should talk about this just a little bit about the future, and then also, why don't you talk just a little bit about the prospect of an extinction? Because in the natural world, extinction is not a rare thing. I've heard statistics like 1,000 or 10,000 species go extinct every day. In the natural world, it's a part of evolution, and not necessarily something you should lament or praise. But what are the prospects for an extinction of a race, and a race that continues to contract, or a race that just continues to degenerate? Let's go there to these kind of dark subjects.
It's a dark place, and
Yeah.
if you mention, you talk about white genocide and so on, to most people, they're just eyes glazed over. They don't want to think about it. They think it's an absurd thing. I was in Washington, D.C. recently, went to the House of Representatives. You look out there, all these white males in power. In a way, we're doing very well.
Right.
But at the same time, we're admitting millions and millions of non-whites into these countries. They have higher birth rates. Well, what's the big story of evolution? Is differential fertility. That's the whole story. That's the whole name of the game. And you have to think about what's it going to be like, not in 50 years, but in 1,000 years. Because evolution has been going on for eons. The extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. We can't even comprehend that in our brains. But you have to think about the very long-term future. And if your group is not reproducing and is giving up territory to people who are reproducing, well, you're going to become a smaller and smaller percentage of that population. Your political power is going to go down. And ultimately, I'm very concerned about victimization. If you're a biologist and evolutionist, you look at the world, ethnic conflicts are the norm throughout human history. If Germans and Poles can't get along, how are blacks and whites going to get along in America, Asians and Mexicans? There's going to be conflict. There already is conflict. Yeah. And we're going to be victimized as we lose political power. And it's going to be more and more obvious.
Also, a lot of ethnic groups they haven't gone extinct so much as they've been dissolved. There aren't groups like the Goths around anymore. There aren't groups like the Romans around anymore. The Jews actually have been remarkable, and that has been a tribe or a race with kind of different parts to it, but a race that has survived, where groups like the Goths or the Romans have been effectively dissolved into a larger family. So, what we could see is in the future the white race dissolving. Again, I don't like thinking about this, but it's if we are just some little people in this mass, multicultural, multiracial society of North America. And we seem to have this tendency towards, universalism and egalitarianism. It seems like we could very well, the whole race could just be dissolved. And again, that sadly seems to be one of the stories of history, is that there'll be a dominant group that will gain power, will gain an empire, and then it will almost, lose by winning. It will be kind of dissolved by the people. And in a way, that's a good thing. The fact that there is a coherence to the white race. We don't have some kind of separate Roman class ruling. We're kind of all Romans to a certain extent. But you could actually see this occur in a really terrible way, particularly in North America, where white people are just kind of slowly dissolved. We never fully go away. A lot of our genes are just spread in this, pool.
Well, I think that's the sort of utopia of the left right there.
Right.
But the fact is that white groups, European groups, have not raised high barriers between themselves and other peoples in general. Certainly a big aspect of Judaism is simply erecting those barriers. If you read the Old Testament, that's really what it's about, is keeping separate.
Yeah.
People, that's why I titled my first book, A People That Shall Dwell Alone. That is like ingrained. But with Europeans, the walls come down. You talked about the Goths. Well, I've been reading about the Goths, and in a way, they were not a true ethnic group, even at the beginning. or maybe at the very early group, but they pretty soon became an army with servants and slaves and other people who were dependent on them, and they weren't really related. And then when they settled areas, into Roman areas, they didn't have big barriers that lasted very long between them and the Romans. They intermarried after a while. They assimilated. And so that's the sort of story of European cultures. They don't persist with setting up these barriers, and they do. And now, because you have immigration from all over the world, well, that's really a strong possibility. And you do see, if you look at the charts for intermarriage, you see steadily rising percentages. They're still not very high, but and I suspect most of the people intermarrying are white, tend to be sort of lower class whites marrying blacks or Hispanics. But it is a phenomenon that is increasing, and it will probably increase in the future. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it mostly white men who engage in miscegenation? That would seem to be the trend.
That could be. I haven't really followed those statistics, but you certainly do see a lot of white women with non-white boyfriends and so on. But
yeah.
It's not good. And I've often said, from the psychological point of view, we can't depend on our natural sort of ethnocentrism because it's pretty much there. We have to depend on a sort of intellectual understanding, and that's the message of Frank Salter's book. He doesn't claim that we have all these psychological mechanisms that evolved to preserve our ethnic interests. Far from it. We don't have that.
Yeah.
But we have to have an understanding of what our ethnic interests are and then try to achieve them. And part of that would be to educate, propagandize. If we had a real media control and so on, we would do that. We would be able to create a healthy white culture. No question about it. But the fact is, our culture's not in our hands anymore. I mean, you turn on the TV, you see what the ads are pushing miscegenation all the time. The TV shows do. It's a constant drumbeat. Well, that has an effect on quite a few people, I think.
Yeah, unquestionably. No, I think the way I've begun to think about it is, and I've been definitely inspired by some other writers who've gotten there certainly long before I did, but I agree. I don't think we could ever be like the Jews. It's just it just doesn't. I mean, maybe we can to a certain extent and in certain ways, but generally speaking, we just don't have it. It's always gonna ring out of tune in people's ears to be that separate and that ethnocentrist and that kind of mean in a way. So I don't see that as occurring. But I could see the idealization of race as in a way a positive step forward, where race is seen as something as an ideal, as something to strive for, as it's not seen as this nasty thing we don't want to talk about, but it's seen as we could transcend ourselves and become something higher. That seems to, in a weird way, you almost have to, that's how you have to talk to white people. You have to kind of put it in this transcendental moral way.
I agree totally. I don't think white people can be motivated to do anything unless they see it as morally acceptable to do that.
Yeah.
They feel a need to be on, and that's why partly that hunter-gatherer ethic that I talk about with the Puritans and the Quakers. That's really where they were at. They were very much into policing other people's behavior and their morals, but everything had a strong moral connotation. And so I think we have to pitch it that way. But I do think that if we had access to the big media, I think, and had a message like you're saying about race, I think it would spread very quickly. I think that there's a lot of implicit whiteness going on. There's a lot of anxiety and anger in white America. They don't know where to turn. They don't trust these elites, these so-called conservative elites, the Republicans. They don't trust them. That's why Donald Trump is doing so well. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of anxiety. But if you got on the news and the newspapers and told people, it's okay to support your race. It's okay to have an immigration policy that's tailored to suit your group and not somebody else's group. These messages are so intuitive, and they are in tune with our natural ethnocentrism, which is not hugely strong system for us, but it does resonate, and we know that whites can be motivated by ethnic messages, by patriotic messages, and so on. So we this could happen, but our problem again is that we have lost control of the culture, whether it's in the academic world or in the media world, the political world, and we have to try to get that back, but it's an uphill struggle.
Right. Well, we are in control of this podcast.
That's right.
And that's something.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin, why don't we just put a bookmark in this discussion? Because I definitely, you should come back on soon, because this, I think we scratched the surface, as often happens. But this has been a great conversation. So thank you.
Okay.